Peace and blessings. Welcome to Season 1 of the Black Man History Podcast. In this season, we are discussing the life of Frederick Douglass. This is episode 1-1, Slave.
Black power, black voice, black stories, black history, black power.
Before we get into the episode, let's briefly discuss who Frederick Douglass was. Frederick Douglass was a self-educated former slave who became a leading figure in the American abolitionist movement. He was internationally recognized as one of the greatest speakers and writers of his time. He was definitely the most famous and influential Black American of the 19th century. Frederick Douglass lived a very eventful life. He was born a slave, but he taught himself how to read and write, and he eventually escaped slavery to become a famous lecturer. He even met with John Brown and discussed John Brown's decision to lead a slave revolt. Frederick Douglass also met with President Abraham Lincoln on at least 2 occasions. And later in life, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Frederick Douglass as a consul-general to Haiti. So now, let's begin our discussion of one of the greatest Black men this country has ever produced, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass's story really begins with Aaron Anthony, who was his owner and most likely, as we'll soon see, most likely his father as well. Aaron Anthony was born in 1767 to a poor farmer, but both of his parents died at an early age. Aaron Anthony eventually worked himself up to become the captain of a ship owned by Maryland's former governor, Edward Lloyd. Now, Edward Lloyd was also a congressman for Maryland, and his family, the Lloyd family, owned a huge plantation called the Y Plantation, and that's W-Y-E, the Y Plantation. Eventually, Aaron Anthony married a wealthy woman named Anne Catherine Skinner. Aaron Anthony also went to work on the Y Plantation for Edward Lloyd as his plantation manager. Basically, Aaron Anthony was an overseer of other overseers. The overseers were obviously the taskmasters of a slave plantation, and Edward Anthony was basically the manager of these overseers. But this arrangement allowed Aaron Anthony to live on the Y Plantation rent-free. Aaron Anthony was very good with money, and eventually he became very wealthy in his own right. It didn't hurt, of course, that he was married to a wealthy woman and lived rent-free on this plantation. Nonetheless, Aaron Anthony's wife died in 1818, the same year that Frederick Douglass was born. Now let's talk about Frederick Douglass's birth and his birthplace. Both of these are important. Frederick was born as a slave on the eastern shore of Maryland in Talbot County in February 1818. The exact date of his birth is not known. His grandmother, named Betsy Bailey, was also a slave, but she was married to a free Black man named Isaac. Together, Betsy and Isaac had 5 children, one of whom was named Harriet. Harriet had 7 children herself, one of whom was named Frederick Augustus Bailey. Now, Frederick's father was most likely Aaron Anthony, who was also his owner and his mother's owner and his grandmother's owner as well, but this is not definite. This is the story that Frederick Douglass was told throughout his childhood, and so this is what he was led to believe. It is highly possible, we do know, we don't have to get into the details, but we do know the traumatic events that happened between slave master and slave during this period of American history. Betsy Bailey's children, Frederick's grandmother, eventually had 20 children altogether, and that made a total of 30 slaves on this land that was owned by Aaron Anthony. Now, when Frederick was about 6 years old, he was sent to live on the Y Plantation. This was around 1824. Aaron Anthony generally had all of his slave children brought to the Y Plantation where he worked and lived. Remember, Aaron Anthony had his own property, but he was the overseer of overseers for the Y Plantation. We're going to get into more details about this Y Plantation in just a moment. Now, once on the Y Plantation, Frederick met many of his sisters and brothers and cousins that he'd never known before. Now, according to Frederick Douglass, most of the slave children, himself included, were usually running around this plantation extremely hungry and half naked. The slave children on this plantation, on the Y plantation, usually were fed some sort of cornmeal mush that was poured into a large trough, and the children then scooped it up and fed themselves using clamshells as spoons. Frederick also mentioned in his autobiographies that he rarely saw his mother during this period of time. She was often hired out to other farms and plantations several miles away. In fact, one of the plantations that she was hired out to was 12 miles away. And so she had to travel 12 miles just to visit her son Frederick. Obviously, this burden would put a lot of stress and toll on a person's body and spirit. Frederick's mother wound up dying in 1826 when he was about 8 years old. Now let's talk about this Y plantation where Frederick lived. The Y plantation was made up of 13 farms and a total of 10,000 acres. At its peak, nearly 1,000 slaves lived and worked on this plantation. The Y plantation in all reality was very similar to a corporation, a factory, and a mega farm all rolled up into one. It would eventually become the largest wheat farm in the country. The Y plantation was located close to the shores of the Chesapeake River. It was about 30 miles southeast of Baltimore, but on the other side of the Chesapeake River. The Lloyd family, the family of Edward Lloyd, who owned this plantation, was one of the richest families in Maryland. The Y plantation was originally built by Edward Lloyd's father, whose name was Edward Lloyd IV, in 1785. Now, 3 different families lived on the Y plantation. There were the slaves, there was Aaron Anthony's family, and then finally there was the Lloyd family. The house slaves on the Y plantation, according to Frederick Douglass, were closer to the white family than the other slaves. Other than their skin color, they had very little in common with the other slaves. Their mannerisms were completely different. They were very loyal to the Lloyd and to Aaron Anthony's family, and the clothing that these house slaves wore was nothing like the rags the field slaves wore. Now, Frederick cited many crimes and injustices that were committed against the black slaves that were working on the Y plantation. He claimed to have witnessed the murder of several slaves before the age of 8. Some of these stories are very gripping and very horrible. One of the most disturbing recollections from Frederick Douglass's autobiography was when he witnessed Aaron Anthony strip and beat Frederick's 15-year-old aunt. Let me read the quote. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped the longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush. And not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. Now, this brutality that Aaron Anthony displayed towards Frederick Douglass's aunt may have been because she would rebuff his sexual advances. Remember, Frederick said his aunt was 15 years old. Aaron Anthony at this time was in his 50s. Frederick Douglass also recalled the brutal beating of a slave woman named Nellie Kellum right in front of her children. Again, we're going to quote from Frederick Douglass's autobiography. There were times when she seemed likely to get the better of the brute, but he finally overpowered her and succeeded in getting his rope around her arms and firmly tying her to the tree at which he had been aiming. This done, and Nellie was at the mercy of his merciless lash, and now, what followed, I have no heart to describe. The cowardly creature made good his every threat and wielded the lash with all the hot zest of furious revenge. The cries of the woman, while undergoing the terrible infliction, were mingled with those of the children, sounds which I hope the reader may never be called upon to hear. When Nellie was untied, her back was covered with blood. The red stripes were all over her shoulders. She was whipped, severely whipped, but she was not subdued, for she continued to denounce the overseer and to call him every vile name. He had bruised her flesh, but had left her invincible spirit undaunted. Unquote. There was another slave on the plantation named Bill Denby, and Frederick Douglass recounts how he witnessed Bill being shot by an overseer after running away from a beating. The overseer was never punished either by law or by Edward Lloyd, who wrote it off as a justified shooting. In other words, this was nothing more than a line item in the expense account of his ledger. Now, Edward Lloyd, the man who owned this entire Y plantation, he could also be very brutal and cruel. Frederick Douglass recounted a time where Edward Lloyd whipped an elderly slave named Barney because the condition of the horse didn't meet his standards. Edward Lloyd made Barney kneel before him and beat him 30 lashes with the horsewhip. So this is the environment that Frederick Douglass spent his early childhood in. But Frederick got a chance that a lot of slaves did not get. It starts with him befriending a young boy named Daniel, who was actually Edward Lloyd's 12-year-old son. Aaron Anthony's daughter, whose name was Lucretia Auld, took a liking to young Frederick. Lucretia Auld was married to the captain of one of Edward Lloyd's ships, a man named Thomas Auld. Lucretia Auld would often give Frederick Douglass pieces of bread or extra bread and bandage his bruises when he got hurt. In March 1826, Frederick suddenly learned that he was being sent to Baltimore. The way it happened was that Lucretia Auld's husband, Thomas Auld, had a brother named Hugh Auld living in Baltimore. Hugh Auld and his wife, Sophia Auld, had a young son named Tommy, and they wanted a little black boy to move to Baltimore to be something like a companion for young Tommy. And who better to choose but Frederick Bailey, who was already a good companion and friend with Edward Lloyd's son. So they wanted Frederick to be a companion for Tommy, and this move to Baltimore would be a major change in Frederick Bailey's life. We're calling him Frederick Bailey now because he had not yet taken the name Frederick Douglass. Now at this time, Baltimore was one of the most important port cities in the nation. It was a major shipbuilding center and had a large number of free blacks, over 14,000. In fact, Maryland had the highest number of free blacks at this time than any other slave state. Now, there were slaves in Baltimore, let's not forget that, but the numbers were steadily decreasing as Baltimore became more of a cosmopolitan city. Now, this shipping industry that was booming in Baltimore created lots of skilled jobs, but there was also a lot of fierce competition for these jobs. Thousands of European immigrants were coming to the United States and moving to Baltimore every year to work in the shipping industry. Now, the white Americans and the white immigrants, they didn't want their jobs going to either slaves who would work for free or to the free blacks. And so this often led to a lot of rioting and violence in the city. Now, when Frederick arrived, he was initially treated with great kindness by the Auld family in Baltimore. Sophia Auld, who was Hugh Auld's wife and Tommy Auld's mother, she especially treated him very kindly. And Frederick eventually became close friends with their son, Tommy. Now, back on the Eastern Shore, things were changing very rapidly. Aaron Anthony, Frederick's owner, so to speak, was getting close to death. And in 1827, barely a year after Frederick moved to Baltimore, Aaron Anthony died. Now, you have to understand that the death of a slave owner was a time of great anxiety for the slaves. The most obvious thing was that the slaves could be divided up between the heirs who could live anywhere in the country, and this would lead to the breakup of the slave families. Or the slaves might be sold off to pay the debts of the former slave owner, thereby also breaking up the slave families. So Frederick returned to the Eastern Shore of Maryland for the inheritance hearing. Now, Aaron Anthony only had 2 living recognized sons. Now, he had other sons like Frederick Douglass, but the only ones that were recognized were 2 men named Richard Anthony and Andrew Anthony. Aaron Anthony's daughter, Lucretia Auld, who had taken such a liking to Frederick, had died while he was in Baltimore. So her inheritance went to her husband, Thomas Auld, who was Hugh Auld's brother. That was a family that Frederick was staying with in Baltimore. So Frederick, who was only 9 years old at the time, wound up becoming the property, I hate to use that phrase, but let's just keep it real, wound up becoming the slave property of Thomas Auld, and Thomas Auld decided to just send Frederick back to Baltimore to stay with his brother Hugh and Sophia and their son Tommy. Now, all of the slaves, however, were as fortunate as Frederick. 3 of his sisters and 1 brother went to Andrew Anthony, one of Aaron Anthony's sons. Now, Andrew Anthony, he was an alcoholic, and he wound up in severe debt and wound up having to sell Frederick's siblings into the Deep South. Well, Frederick is back in Baltimore now, and Sophia Auld, for whatever reason, took it upon herself to teach Frederick how to read. First, she taught him the alphabet, and by the age of 10, she was beginning to teach him how to spell. However, when Frederick was around 11 years old, her husband, Hugh Auld, found out. When he found out, he forbade his wife from teaching Frederick how to read any longer. Hugh Auld basically said that reading would make Frederick unfit to be a slave. I'm going to read you a quote from Frederick Douglass's autobiography that sheds some light on this incident. Master Hugh was amazed at the simplicity of his spouse, and probably for the first time, he unfolded to her the true philosophy of slavery and the peculiar rules necessary to be observed by masters and mistresses in the management of their human chattels. Mr. Auld promptly forbade continuance of her instruction, telling her, in the first place, that the thing itself was unlawful, that it was also unsafe and could only lead to mischief. To use his own words further, he said, "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell. He should know nothing but the will of his master and learn to obey it. If you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read the Bible, there will be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him for the duties of a slave. And, as to himself, learning would do him no good, but probably a great deal of harm, making him disconsolate and unhappy." Well, when Frederick heard those words, they motivated him to learn even more. Because now, at the young age of 11 years old, Frederick understood that the difference between being a slave and being free was education. Now, Sophia obeyed her husband, and she did try to stop Frederick from reading. But it was too late now. The cow was out the barn, or the horse was out the barn, whatever animal it was too late. Frederick did everything he could to get his hands on reading material. Now, since he couldn't learn to read at home, Frederick went to the immigrant boys in the streets of Baltimore. Many of these immigrant kids, they were actually much worse off than Frederick. Even though he was a slave, he at least was fed properly. Many of these immigrant kids were near starvation. So Frederick paid them with food that he took from Sophia's kitchen to give him spelling lessons. And then in 1830, at the age of 12, Frederick purchased a book called The Columbian Orator. Now, he was able to buy it because he used money that he earned from doing odd jobs around the shipyards. Remember, though he was a slave, his primary job was just to be a friend to Tommy. So he was able to use his free time to do little jobs around the shipyards. The folks would pay him a little bit here and there, and he used that money to buy The Columbian Orator. Now, the Columbian Orator was a very common reading book for school children at this time. It was written by a man named Caleb Bingham, who died in 1817. The book was intended to educate the young nation's youth, that is, the United States. It was a young nation at this time. It was intended to educate the youth of the United States. And the book contained rules on speaking and oratory. It also had poems, essays, and lots of famous speeches at that time. Now, one thing you got to understand is that the author, Caleb Bingham, he was originally from Connecticut and was actually against slavery. So many of this sentiment made it into his book, and this was a book that Frederick Douglass was using to learn to read, or actually to improve his reading, because he already kind of had the gist of reading by this time. Frederick studied this book religiously, even though he had to do it in secret. So when the Auld family, when Hugh and Sophia and Tommy, when they left town, Frederick would stay behind and use this period of time to study this book in secret. And the more he read and the more he learned, the more he came to hate slavery in his current condition. So in actuality, Hugh Auld's prediction had come true. Education and reading had made Frederick Douglass unfit to be a slave. So the years go by and Frederick is now a teenager, and Sophia is still trying to keep him from reading, and this constant back and forth between him trying to read and she trying to keep him from reading, it made him become more withdrawn and moody. Now, teenagers are moody anyway, so you can imagine how much more difficult, how much more depressing it would have been for Frederick Douglass to have this woman basically trying to keep him dumb, keep him ignorant, and he has to find ways to sneak around that. Well, in 1831, Frederick overheard conversations and whispers about an uprising led by a man named Nathaniel Turner. And it was around this time that Frederick also became more religious. He was about 13, 14 years old around this time. Frederick became friends with an old black slave named Charles Lawson. Now, this elderly black slave was almost illiterate, but his understanding of the Bible made a huge impression on young Frederick. So these two, the young Frederick and the old man, they spent a lot of time praying and reading the Bible together. So Frederick would read the verses from the Bible and Charles Lawson would interpret them and give them some sort of spiritual meaning. And this friendship with this old man helped to rekindle Frederick's hope for freedom, which had recently gone dormant with his back and forth with Sophia Auld. So this motivated Frederick to really focus on learning to write. He already knew how to read, but now he wanted to learn how to write. And so while he picked up these odd jobs at the local shipyards, he would study the letters and the words that the carpenters and the craftsmen in the shipyards were using. When he was home alone, he would go and take little Tommy Auld's school books and study them to further improve his writing skills. Well, everything changed in 1833. In 1833, Hugh Auld in Baltimore had a falling out and a dispute with his brother, Thomas Auld, who was legally Frederick's owner. So with this dispute between the two brothers, Frederick had to leave Baltimore and return to the eastern shore of Maryland in 1833, back to the plantation. Thomas Auld was not a wealthy man. He was, as I mentioned, the captain of a ship owned by Edward Lloyd. He also operated a local general store, but he didn't really have the financial and money skills of his father-in-law, or maybe his former father-in-law, Aaron Anthony. So all of the slaves that Thomas Auld owned, he had acquired through inheritance. Thomas Auld was married to Lucretia Auld, who was Aaron Anthony's daughter, but Lucretia Auld died a few years back while Frederick was in Baltimore. Since that time, Thomas Auld had remarried, and both he and his new wife were very cruel to their slaves. Thomas Auld would beat Frederick as well as Frederick's crippled aunt, a woman named Henny. Now, Frederick wasn't really bothered by his own beatings. He seemed as if he was able to take it, but he mentioned being so disturbed and very hurt by the vicious beatings that these two, Thomas Auld and his new wife, put upon Henny, who was, by the way, crippled. Now, the worst of all was that Thomas Auld was supposed to be some devout Christian, but to Frederick, this was nothing but hypocrisy. Frederick once again went into a depression. He was always hungry in the crowded Thomas Auld household, and the only food the slaves could eat was most of the time just cornmeal mush. Now, things got worse when a local white man in the region learned that Frederick could read. He asked Frederick to help him organize a Sunday school for free blacks living in the eastern shore of Maryland. Well, eventually, somehow or another, Thomas Auld found out, and he led a mob of men to attack, beat up, and break up this small school after only 2 meetings. Now just think about that. Think about that. Thomas Auld and this mob of white men attacked free black men who were trying to learn to read. That really says something. Well, Frederick, who was now about 15 years old, he already didn't have too much respect for Thomas Auld to begin with, but now he really lost all respect for Thomas Auld. And he began to rebel against Thomas Auld in any way he could. He would let his horse run away. He would refuse to work. he would talk back to Thomas Auld and give him back talk and sass. Now finally, Thomas Auld got fed up and he basically had the mindset, I'm going to teach this ninja a thing or two. Let me put this ninja in his place. And ninja is not the word I want to use, but I'm trying to stay away from the other word. So Thomas Auld decided to send Frederick to a local white man who specialized in breaking unruly slaves. That was his profession. That's what he was known for. He was known for putting black people in their place. Well, in the next episode, we'll discuss that in more depth, inshallah. We'll see how Frederick Douglass deals with this slave breaker and how he finally decided it was time to escape slavery. But until then, peace and blessings, family.